Autism has been in the news a lot lately, and for parents navigating a new diagnosis or those simply hearing a lot of information online, it can be confusing and at times disheartening to hear how autistic children are spoken about. Today, we're cutting through the noise and grounding our conversation not just in evidence, but in lived experience. Welcome to Healthy Children, the podcast for parents from the American Academy of Pediatrics. I'm Dr. Edith Bracho-Sanchez. I'm a pediatrician and a mama figuring it out. This is a judgment-free space where all questions are good questions and the answers will hopefully be even better. Let's get started. Today we're talking autism, and to do so, I have with me Dr. Tommy Martin, who is a combined internal medicine and pediatric physician and works as a pediatric hospitalist. Tommy, welcome!
Dr. Edith, it is so incredible to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I am so glad that you're here. I can't think of a better person to have this conversation with right now in this moment in time. And I wanted to start with your family story, which we're so lucky that you have shared openly on your platforms over the years. Can you share a bit about Oliver?
Yeah, I would love to. And so for the listeners who may not know, I have a son. His name is Oliver, and he is truly the most incredible child in the world. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased being his father, but he is truly a remarkable boy. Actually, one of his teachers just told us that he is the definition of joy or joy in human form, and I believe that is so true. And so my son Oliver has an extremely rare genetic condition called Lamb-Schafer syndrome. There's only 500 people in the world with this diagnosis, so it's extremely rare, and it's characterized by deletion in the SOX5 gene. But with that, later on in his life, when he was about 2.5, he also received the diagnosis of autism. And since having the diagnosis of autism, I have been a huge advocate about spreading awareness about autism and helping the world understand that children and people with autism may be different, but that does not make them any less or any less valuable, and that they are uniquely, wonderfully them, and that is just perfect.
Yeah. And you had been doing this work, as you mentioned, years before the current communication landscape. So I'm curious, how did your medical training intersect or even clash with your experience as a parent navigating this for your own child?
Yeah, it was so interesting. Honestly, I think my wife and I, we are both physicians, and we actually didn't really think our son had autism. So I think my medical background and kind of some of my training steered me away from my son having the diagnosis of autism. And I think that's so important to point out because it really shows that autism does not just fit one picture that you may have in your mind about what autism looks like. One of my favorite quotes is, if you have met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism, right? Like every single diagnosis, every single person with autism is very different. And so I think the way it clashed for us was really maybe a delay in diagnosis, because we had this picture textbook definition of what autism may look like. But when Oliver was evaluated by a specialist, we actually found that he did have autism. And once we received that diagnosis, it helped us to get resources in place to help him reach his fullest potential.
Yeah. It's so interesting that you bring up that quote and that way of thinking about children with autism, because that is one thing that our developmental and, neurology colleagues where I work have taught us. We are understanding so much about how much of a spectrum this truly is. And it's so true. You've met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism. They can all present so differently. So it's just so important that you bring that up, I think. And Tommy, you're of course familiar with the data because you need to be to do your job as a physician and as a communicator, and because of the way that this has impacted your family, right? I mean, you have to be familiar with the data from all the different hats that you wear. We've seen autism diagnosis rise significantly in recent decades. What's behind that rise, Tommy?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And so the rise that Dr. Edith is talking about is that now we see that about 1 in somewhere between like 35 and 37 children will be diagnosed with autism, which if you look at just the numbers and look back from 40 years ago, it would seem that it is so many more people that's being diagnosed with autism. But there's really good explanations behind that. And a lot of it would be, one would be awareness. Just about everyone knows about autism now. And children not only know about autism, but we're not afraid to hide the diagnosis. We're not afraid to be loud and proud about our children having autism. So awareness about autism is one of the key things. Another thing would be improved screening. So screening all throughout pediatrician's office, even in school screening. There's a lot more screening and better screening that is happening now than what was 30, 40 years ago. And so what we're seeing is not necessarily new diagnoses as if the children previously didn't have autism. It's just that they are actually being diagnosed earlier and getting the therapies they need. Another aspect of it would be with the changes in the diagnosis criteria, that we used to have a lot of different diagnoses, and those different diagnoses are now put into one autism spectrum disorder. And so lumping those diagnoses into one diagnosis also would falsely elevate the actual number of people being diagnosed with autism. So it's not that we're seeing a true rise in autism rates, as in more children are developing autism. It's just that more people are getting diagnosed with it because of those factors.
Yeah. The next question I always get asked, and I'm sure you get asked this question as well, is what are the causes, right? So now that we're talking about expanding criteria, as you just explained so clearly, and a rise in diagnosis and how we explain it, parents still, after we say this and explain this to them, they'll sit there and they'll say, yeah, totally, that makes sense. We have better diagnosis. We're doing better screening. We are putting more children under this umbrella, understanding that this is a spectrum, right? And
Mhm.
yet I still want to understand the causes. So, what does the science actually show about what leads to autism?
Yeah, the first thing that I'll say is science is always evolving. But as it currently stands, the science that we have would show one, the definition of autism would be that it's a neurodevelopmental condition that impacts the way a child communicates with the world, experiences the world, and interacts with the world. And with that, they have differences in the way they verbally communicate with it. And then there's usually also restrictive or repetitive behaviors. And those are two kind of big categories that help us diagnose autism. And so once you have that framework of what autism is, then it goes into, well, what is the cause of those neurodevelopmental differences? And there are a multitude of things that we know that could potentially lead to the cause of autism, and then things that we know that do not cause autism. And so some of the things, number one would be genetic factors. As research continues and continues to come out, we know that there are multiple genes associated with a higher risk of autism and likely leads to the autism diagnosis. But outside of genetic factors, which we know are the main contributing factor, there are also environmental factors. And there are a multitude of these, and I'll just list a couple, but there are a lot of them. One would be parental age, so maternal and paternal age. So a higher age would increase the risk. Also, different complications during pregnancy. And so that could be extremely high fevers during pregnancy or infections during pregnancy, very low birth weight or prematurity. All of those could increase the risk of a child developing later on down the road. And those are just a short list. There are a multitude of others. Something I also always like to tell parents is that there's nothing that you did that caused this. Unfortunately, it is genetic and environmental. I know that whenever our child gets a diagnosis, we feel the guilt upon us. And I just want you to know that there is nothing that you did that led to this. And in the news, I know that you guys have also probably seen a lot of headlines about Tylenol causing autism, vaccine causing autism. These are both things that we have a lot of data that show that that is not true, that Tylenol during pregnancy does not cause autism. And the study that they pointed to did not account for confounding factors. And so for the listeners, what that would mean is that you have maybe a mom that had an infection during pregnancy, and maybe they had a really high fever, and then they took Tylenol. And so saying that Tylenol led to the diagnosis of autism later, but not counting for the high fever or infection doesn't really make sense. And so a lot of those studies do not account for those confounding factors. And then when we look at vaccines, we have endless data showing that vaccines do not lead to an increased rise of autism and does not cause autism. And this can be really confusing and it can be really hard to understand, especially as parents when you have a child and maybe you do not remember any of these risk factors, or maybe you do not remember having a fever during pregnancy or an infection during pregnancy, or you do not remember a distant cousin that maybe was diagnosed with Asperger's previously. And then you have a child that seems to be developing appropriately, but then around 12 to 24 months of age, you start noticing delays and you're like, Well, they were getting a lot of vaccines then, so maybe it was the vaccines that triggered it. And so oftentimes what we see in the research is that they will take that population group and look at exactly that time frame. And yes, they'll account for vaccines, but then also look, well, what happened prenatally? What happened during intrapartum? Look at the families, like all the family members' history. Was there any autism? Was there any developmental delays in any family members? And when we look at all these confounding factors, we see that the vaccines actually were the outlier and didn't contribute to it, but there were other risk factors that very likely did contribute to it.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you explained it that way. And those studies and the way that you just talked about looking at it has been looked across thousands and thousands, I should say hundreds of thousands, probably millions of children at this point, right? It's not that we've taken a couple of children to see whether vaccines were the outliers and everything else was a better explanation, so to speak. It's that this has been done over hundreds of thousands of national and international level type of studies, right?
Dr. Edith, really quickly, something I also wanted to mention is that at the very beginning, I said that autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, right? And so we know very early on during pregnancy and really throughout pregnancy, the child's brain is developing. And so neurodevelopmental changes, when some of these risk factors may arise, can impact the way that the brain is developing and then lead to autism down the road. So it's usually a genetic predisposition with this environmental factor that affects the neurodevelopment, leading to autism down the road.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I also wonder, Tommy, like when you're talking to families in
Mhm.
real life, right? You and I both see families wrestling with information that they encounter online. Why do you think myths about vaccines and autism remain so persistent, even after decades of high quality research that disprove them, as we're talking about?
Yeah, I think one would be social media. We know that misinformation spreads faster than factual information. And with this myth going on from way back when the study that's been throughout kind of made it really popular to say that vaccine cause autism. I think that myth just carries on through social media and people retweet it, people repost it on social media, so people see it all the time. And the other thing is that, unfortunately, when autism is diagnosed or when we start to see the signs and symptoms that a child may have autism, coincides when we give vaccines. And that is an unfortunate coincidence. And so when a family member sees that and experiences that, it's really hard not to put the two together, especially when you've already like witnessed and saw all the misinformation online and then you personally experience it. It's really hard for your brain not to make those two connections and to separate your lived experience and what you saw happen with the, research upon millions of people. And so something that's important to note is also looking at autism rates in unvaccinated children and seeing that they do have autism as well. And it's not just the children with vaccines that get autism. And so unfortunately, when we start to see developmental delays, does coincide when we get vaccines, but that is because we vaccinate children when they are at the highest risk, and that is when they're going through those developmental years.
Yeah. I always sort of say I understand the need as a mom, right, to
Mhm.
have a cause, a reason. This was the thing, right? But yes, as you mentioned, at this point, we know vaccines are not the cause of
Yeah.
autism.
And Dr. Edith, I understand that as well. Like my wife and I, when we received our son's diagnosis of Lamb-Schafer syndrome, we searched for everything that we could have done that led to him having this diagnosis. And even though we knew that it was a deletion in a gene, we still looked. Like as humans, we are so quick to try to put the blame on ourselves and like, what did we do that caused this to happen to our child? And truthfully, oftentimes the answer is nothing, like that you did not do this. It wasn't you ensuring that your child was safe from infections and getting them vaccinated that caused this. It wasn't, that you took Tylenol during pregnancy that led to this. It wasn't any of these things. Unfortunately, it was just the way that they were born and that their genetics likely led to this. And just like our son, even though Lamb-Schafer syndrome and autism are two different things, I could still include the autism in this, even though my wife and I searched high and low for things that we did that caused this. Even though I'm a physician and know it was genetic causes, it was still hard for us to wrestle with and try not to find something that we did that caused this.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I so appreciate you sharing that. And Tommy, so far we've been talking about, families who are considering vaccinating, who are hearing these myths and misinformation spread online. I wonder also if you can talk a little bit about what the dangers are when the wrong information spreads unchecked for families that are raising children with autism. And I think, it's sort of two sides of a coin almost. It's
Mhm.
one, we're thinking about how we're communicating with families who are weighing risk and benefits of vaccinating. But I think when we talk about this, we also can't forget children who already have a diagnosis of autism.
Yeah.
You know that firsthand. So, what are the dangers? What is the harm there when the wrong information is spreading for those families who are already raising children with autism?
Yeah, so I'm going to start at the very beginning. So one would be just with the vaccination. And so obviously, if they've heard the wrong information to where they are afraid of getting their child vaccinated and they choose to not get them vaccinated, that puts them at risk for multiple different infections, which could have serious adverse effects, which we all pretty much know. The second would be unregulated treatments. And so when this misinformation is spread and their child has autism and they look to the internet, oftentimes you'll see different treatments for autism that may not be backed by evidence. And so a lot of times that may lead to buying supplements or buying other things online or detoxes. I see all the time of people swearing that this is going to cure or improve their child's autism symptoms. And unfortunately, the risk behind that would be taking unregulated medications that could also have adverse effects. Second would be the financial cost. Oftentimes, these detoxes or supplements can be extremely costly. And a family that is so vulnerable and wanting to do everything to get their child improvement, they could spend a lot of money trying to find that fix that just isn't real and is not evidence-based. The third thing would be delay in behavioral therapy. So there are multitudes of different therapies that could help children with autism, and to get on the right program in schooling to make sure that they have like a 504 plan or physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, ABA therapy, all of these different therapies that we know greatly improve lived experiences of children with autism. And it could delay those therapies if parents believe that they seek alternative treatments or fixes that may not be evidence-based. And so even outside of just a vaccination standpoint, this misinformation can lead to delay in therapies that could benefit the quality of life of these children. One last thing that I'll also say is that misinformation isn't only about diagnosis and treatment of people with autism. It's also how we characterize them and talk about them at a population level. And in the news, especially over the past 6 months, we have seen the way that these children and way that the people with autism are discussed is a burden to society. And that autism should be something that needs to be cured and that has to be cured because of this burden to society. And that's completely not true. Just because someone has autism and because they see and interact with the world differently does not make them less, and it does not make them a burden. It makes them misunderstood. And what they need more than anything is a world that tries and strives to understand them to better meet their needs than try to fix something that's not supposed to be fixed.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I was hoping that you would, because I think, I've watched your advocacy, some of your advocacy. I'm sure you do so much more that, is not necessarily public facing, right? And I think you've just so eloquently talked about this point, right? Of the way that we are portraying people who are on the spectrum right now, and really just it not being what they need, right? And what their families need. So to pivot for a moment, Tommy, I think there might be people listening. I think every time I have a conversation about autism, I'm sure this happens to you as well. There are families who are listening who are wondering, right? Because development in general is such a spectrum, and sometimes raising kids can be like such a journey, right? Even from one kid to another kid. And so they might be sitting there wondering, like trying to learn so much more about autism, but at the end of the day, saying, could my child have it? Could my child not have it? Tell us, just to spell it out, right? Signs and symptoms that families should be on the lookout for and bring to their pediatrician.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm glad you asked this question because it is extremely important. One thing that I'll say before I even discuss this is do not hesitate to ask your pediatrician for an evaluation or raise concerns that you think that your child is different or may have autism or that you're noticing some delays. Like, do not hesitate, because even if you're wrong, the worst that happens is that they get an evaluation to make sure that you are wrong, right? But
Yes.
if they do have the diagnosis, then they get treatment and therapies as early as possible, which is a huge benefit. And so some of the first things that you need to be looking for would be speech delay. So speech delay is extremely common in children with autism. And, the speech delay generally will start to notice between 12 is very early, but somewhere between 12 and 18 months if children aren't starting to really vocalize, and raising those concerns to your pediatrician. The way that they interact and play with peers or friends could be extremely different than, like, say, maybe their brother or sister. And so oftentimes you'll see a child who maybe doesn't interact with another child. They might play in the same room as another child, but they're off by themselves and maybe not playing appropriately. And actually, I think this would be a good opportunity to use my son as an example. And so Oliver, like I said, is extremely joyous. And why my wife and I did not think that he had autism is because he was extremely social, meaning that, like, if we were to go on an airplane, he would want to say hi in his own way to every single person on that plane. Like, if the plane had 50 rows of seats, he would say hi 48 times. Okay. So just like extremely, extremely social. And when we look at autism, we see that there are difference in social interactions. And then the second would be repetitive or restrictive behaviors. And so even though Oliver was extremely social, he was inappropriately social, meaning that the way he would interact would not necessarily be typically how someone would socially interact. And that's not something we necessarily caught on to until a team of developmental pediatricians and a psychologist and everybody got together and they kind of witnessed that. And so I think seeing differences in social interaction is one key, and then repetitive or restrictive behaviors. And so repetitive behaviors, for an example, would be, so my son absolutely loves suitcases. And he could push his suitcase back and forth literally for hours. So this repetitive action of pushing his suitcase back and forth. Or another one would be picking up rocks and dropping them. So the repetitive behavior of feeling that texture of rocks on his fingers and dropping it would be another sign and symptom of like repetitive or restrictive behaviors. And so those are two big categories. And the way that those appear to children vary drastically from child to child. And so I think picking up on those signs and symptoms early and bringing them to the attention of your pediatrician can be extremely helpful.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you're bringing those examples, which are adorable, by the way, from, your experience with Oliver, because I think sometimes, when you look online, they'll say, well, spinning and hand flapping. And sure, some children with autism do spin and do some hand flapping, but I think there's such a wide range of things that they might like to do. And so expanding it, broadening it, so to speak, to talk about really just the restrictive interests, right? And the repetitive
Mhm.
behaviors, whatever those may look like, are things to be on the lookout for.
And just two other things that I would just mention really quickly would be eye
Yeah.
contact. And so Oliver may talk to us, but he may not be looking us directly in the eyes. And so children at a very young age, they may not have that just developmentally yet, but eventually they should be able to communicate with you by looking eye to eye. But children with autism may look off to the side or look somewhere else while they're having that conversation. And so that could also be another feature, or just difficulty of back and forth communication in general.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you started to mention this, but I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about it. There's countless therapies, programs, claims online, often very expensive things
Mhm.
online. What interventions are truly backed by evidence?
Yeah, so any of the developmental therapies, such as physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy, all of those are backed by evidence, and they do truly help in terms of improving the development of the child, whether they have autism or not autism and just those developmental delays. But children with autism benefit from those therapies. And also, I want to mention ABA therapy.
Yes.
I know that it has received a bad reputation from decades past of maybe inappropriate different therapies being interventions for children. But I believe that ABA therapy, constructed how it's supposed to be done, is extremely beneficial. And we do have evidence showing that children with autism, if they respond well to ABA therapy, it can drastically improve their quality of life and how they interact with the world. And so we use ABA therapy. I believe we currently get 20 to 25 hours a week, somewhere around there. And it has helped Oliver so much just with his communication, with his ability to say, eat at a table. And even though the way he eats may look differently, and just his ability to do that. And so ABA therapy would be another backed by evidence therapy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Huge fan of ABA, applied behavioral analysis therapy. I have seen it make a huge difference for my patients. So huge fan there. Not always easy to get, as you probably know, but huge fan when we can get it for kids. Now, to go back for a moment to your beautiful family, Tommy, on a day-to-day level, what has helped your son thrive and what has helped you all as a family?
Yeah, I think there are a multitude of things that have helped Oliver thrive. And I think number one would be having a team of people. Going through any diagnosis is hard to do it alone. And so having a team at his school of his physical therapist, occupational therapist, speech therapist, his aqua therapist, his ABA therapist. So having this ginormous team all with the same goal to help Oliver reach his fullest potential, I think has been extremely advantageous. Another thing is that with our entire team, knowing that Oliver's diagnosis is not something to fix or to cure, but to try to understand as a team and try to help him navigate the world and navigate in a way that he enjoys and can thrive in. And being okay that that may look completely different. Knowing that maybe at recess, Oliver just wants to play with rocks and pick up and drop rocks. And if that brings him joy, that should bring all of us joy. And not having a team that tries to change that and say, no, Oliver, you need to be swinging because that's what the other kids are doing. Well, just because one kid likes to swing doesn't mean Oliver has to like to swing. And that's completely okay and appropriate. And so I think having a team on the same page has been super important. Another thing that's maybe a little atypical, but would be to watch or read resources that helps the world understand children with autism. And so one example would be a movie called The Unbreakable Boy. And when I watched this movie, it's going to make me cry just thinking about it. But I would love to think that as a pediatrician, as a father to a child with autism, that like I did my best to understand Oliver and how he interacts and sees the world. But I truly do not believe I understood how intricate and how wonderful his mind operates until I watched the movie The Unbreakable Boy, because you see this father, have these frustrations and trying to understand his child and trying to just wrestle with the idea that his child is different, come to really see the world through his child's eyes. And like when I watched that movie, it truly helped me understand that, man, Oliver loves to pick up rocks and drop them because the sensation that he feels in his hands overwhelms his body and makes him feel so at peace. Or when he swings and is just filled with so much joy and can do it for hours, it may feel like he's on an airplane flying through the most beautiful sunrise or sunset ever. And so just having families go through and truly try to understand their child as different, and that difference being so beautiful. And when we don't see it as beautiful, it's not because it's not beautiful, it's because we just don't understand or see the beauty in it yet. And if we could open our eyes and our hearts to see that beauty, I think we could truly transform the way the world sees children with autism.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, Tommy, we're having this conversation and I am very pregnant, as you know. And, the way that you're talking about really, you're talking about a reframing of your understanding of joy and how your child will interact with the world and what we all want for our kids, which is to experience the world in a way that is joyful to them, right? And I think that
Yeah.
reframing, gosh, is so important. And I'm also going to get emotional because I'm a hormonal mess right now, but I'm just so grateful that you are speaking so eloquently about your experience with Oliver and that reframing of parenting, really, that happens for so many families, not just with children with autism, but with so many other differences in medical conditions. So I'm really just so grateful to you. I wanted to end our show like we always do with, a parenting prescription of something you want parents to remember. I truly can't think of a better way to end our show than this very honest and candid, conversation we're having about a reframing of parenting, really. But is there anything else, Tommy, that you want to add to our understanding of kids with autism?
So I want to reiterate everything I just said, but I also want to, and this won't be my optimistic, joyful, usual note, but I want to be real with parents and let them know that it's okay to grieve the expectations of what your child's future you thought it could be. And that process can be really hard. Like I played all the sports in high school and in college, and like wanted nothing more to have a child or a boy that would be on the football team and do all these things and maybe go off to college and live completely on their own. And I'm not saying that Oliver won't be able to. I will say the odds are against him, but I would never let his diagnosis define his potential. But it's okay to grieve those thoughts that you had, that or the future that you thought your child may have, and that it may look different. And so do not feel guilty for grieving that. That's completely normal and completely okay. And I think in that grieving process, when you come to see that your child's goals and aspirations and joys and passions in life may be different than what you had envisioned, and you see that that's okay and that they could still be celebrated just as much, then I think it really helps us to come to terms with the diagnosis and start to live and see the world through their eyes and through their joys and through their passions. And so, although I wanted more than anything for Oliver to go and play football, he may just want to go and be a gardener and pick up rocks. And if that's the case, I'm fine with that. And I hope he's the best one in the world at it. Or he may want to be a luggage person and just push luggage around. And if that's the case, I am thrilled about it. And so I would say just it's okay to grieve the loss of what you had expected. But I hope that you could see that in doing so, you'll also come to see that it's okay that their journey is going to look different and that they may achieve differences. And then the last thing that I always say on all my social medias is that do not let your child's diagnosis define them, and that their potential far surpasses anything you'll see online, far surpasses any textbook, far surpasses any medical diagnosis. And truly, the only thing that would limit them is a world that does not understand them and a world that does not give them the resources they need to thrive.
Thank you. I really cannot thank you enough for being with us today, for the advocacy that you do, for sharing all of our story, and just for being so real with us about what your parenting journey has looked like. So thank you so much, Dr. Tommy Martin, for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you, Dr. Edith.